Genesis 19, reading the whole chapter. Hear the word of the Lord. The two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed himself with his face to the earth and said, "My lords, please turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may rise up early and go on your way." They said, "No, we will spend the night in the town square." But he pressed them strongly, so that they turned aside to him and entered his house. And he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house. And they called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us, that we may know them." And Lot went out to the men in the entrance, shut the door after him, and said, "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Behold, I have two daughters who have not known any man. Let me bring them out to you, and you do with them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." But they said, "Stand back." And they said, "This fellow came to sojourn, and he has become the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them." Then they pressed hard against the man Lot and drew near to break the door down. But the men reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck with blindness the men who were at the entrance of the house, both small and great, so that they wore themselves out groping for the door. Then the men said to Lot, "Have you anyone else here? Sons-in-law, sons, daughters, or anyone you have in the city? Bring them out of this place. For we are about to destroy this place, because the outcry against this people has become great before the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it." So Lot went out and said to his sons-in-law, who were to marry his daughters, "Up, get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city." But he seemed to his sons-in-law to be jesting. As morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, "Up, take your wife and your two daughters who are here, lest you be swept away in the punishment of the city." But he lingered. So the men seized him and his wife and his two daughters by the hand, the Lord being merciful to him. And they brought him out and set him outside the city. And as they brought them out, one said, "Escape for your life. Do not look back or stop anywhere in the valley. Escape to the hills, lest you be swept away." And Lot said to them, "Oh no, my lords. Behold, your servant has found favor in your sight, and you have shown me great kindness in saving my life. But I cannot escape to the hills, lest the disaster overtake me and I die. Behold, this city is near enough to flee to, and it is a little one. Let me escape there. Is it not a little one? And my life will be saved." He said to him, "Behold, I grant you this favor also, that I will not overthrow the city that you have spoken. Escape there quickly, for I can do nothing till you arrive there." Therefore the name of the city was called Zoar. The sun had risen on the earth when Lot came to Zoar. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven, and he overthrew those cities and all the earth and all the inhabitants of the cities and what grew on the ground. But Lot's wife behind him looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. And Abraham went early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord, and he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the valley, and he looked, and behold, the smoke of the land went up like the smoke of a furnace. So it was that when God destroyed the cities of the valley, God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow, and when he had overthrew the cities in which Lot had lived. Now Lot went up out of Zoar and lived in the hills with his two daughters, for he was afraid to live in Zoar. So he lived in a cave with his two daughters. And the firstborn said to the younger, "Our father is old, and there's not a man on earth to come into us after the manner of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve offspring from our father." So they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in and lay with her father, and he did not know when she lay down or when she arose. The next day the firstborn said to the younger, "Behold, I lay last night with my father. Let us make him drink wine tonight also. Then you go in and lie with him, that we may preserve offspring from our father." So they made their father drink wine that night also, and the younger arose and lay with him, and he did not know when she lay down or when she arose. Thus both the daughters of Lot became pregnant by their father. The firstborn bore a son and called his name Moab, He's the father of the Moabites to this day. The younger also bore a son and called his name Ben-Ami. He's the father of the Ammonites to this day. May the Lord add his blessings to the reading of his holy word. Well, which is worse, sex or violence? People decried too much sex and violence in our entertainment. Well, which is worse? If we could cut one but had to keep the other, which is the worst one? So the one that should be cut, sex or violence? Some people say that, well, sex in movies and songs and novels and video games, that's not really bad. It's just prudish to think it's bad. Something's wrong with it because it's natural. But that violence, on the other hand, that is harmful. That if you show violence to people, people will then become violent. Well, that's the idea anyway. But I lived in Singapore, which allows more violence on TV than they do here. But the society there in Singapore has very little violence in society and is very strict on sex that is allowed to be shown in the media. Pornography was illegal and defined very broadly there. A magazine like Cosmopolitan was considered pornography and it was banned. Movies with any sexual content in them were censored. The sexual parts were censored, no nudity. Not that the people, mostly Chinese, were Victorian or prudish, repressive when it comes to sex. Their attitude about it is oddly from a Western point of view, unashamed. Ask a Singaporean child where babies come from, and you'll get no silly talk about storks or them somehow coming out of mothers' stomachs. The description from even small children can best be described as very clinical. Sex itself is not treated as something shameful, but sexualization is. Sexualization is making someone exclusively sexual, like the nude model in pornography. The former Prime Minister of Singapore insisted that it was harmful to young men to see pictures of nude women merely for sexual interest, and so his government cracked down on pornography. Lately, psychologists and others in America have likewise insisted that it's harmful to young women to get the unspoken message through pictures, models, television, movies, and so on, that the most important thing about them is to be sexy, being hot. The American Psychological Association did a detailed study on the sexualization of girls, and they concluded, quote, virtually every media form studied provides ample evidence of the sexualization of women, including television, music videos, music lyrics, movies, magazines, sports media, video games, the internet, and advertising. They found that sexualization is linked to common mental health problems in girls and women, like eating disorders, low self-esteem, and depression. The open flaunting of sex produces sexualization, which is worse than the realistic portrayal of violence, because that does not promote violence. Does anyone watching the first 20 minutes of Saving Private Ryan think, wow, I wish I could do that. I wish I was there? Well, no. But pornography does have that impact. Sexualization is one expression of what the Bible calls the carnal mind, the mind dominated by the flesh. In Genesis 19, we see what happens when that mind, left to itself, unchecked by the Spirit, stoked, fanned into flame by the world, when the world and the flesh kind of feed off each other, creating a cycle of ever-increasing wickedness, including and especially sexualization. We see that cycle here, the flesh seeking gratification and the world just cheering it on, saying, go for it, creating a tornado of lust and perversion, and the Lord steps in and says, I will destroy it. In Genesis 19, we see that in 4 parts: the demonstration, deliverance, devastation, and debauchery. Well, first, the demonstration. Well, which is worse? Evil that is suppressed, censored, unseen, kept down, or evil that demonstrates itself? Well, many Christians would say, well, neither's worse, neither's better. I mean, that's true, because God sees them both. It's no different to him. But evil that demonstrates itself, it's allowed to demonstrate itself. It's unashamed, it's out of the open. A Pride Month to celebrate it, uncensored. That spreads, so that it becomes worse and worse. This chapter begins soon after chapter 18, just continuing this journey of these There's first three angels with Abraham, now there's only two. They come to Sodom. The Lord in human form was with them earlier when they were with Abraham. Now he is gone, and they are met by Lot sitting at the city gate. And that, to us, that's just kind of, it doesn't mean much, but the city gate was where the leaders of the city met. So that he's allowed to sit there means that he's an important person in Sodom. It's where the leaders met. They heard legal cases. They made decisions about the city. You had two men that had a difference. They were suing each other over some property. They bring it to the elders sitting at the city gate, and they would decide. That Lot was sitting there indicates that now he is some part of the leadership of Sodom. This is the end of his process of assimilation into Sodom. He began by living near Sodom in chapter 13, then in it by chapter 14, and now he is a leader of it. And all of that, despite Genesis chapter 13, verse 13, saying the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. Lot gradually got numbed to the demonstrations of wickedness that he saw all around him, and he felt more and more at home there. Well, Lot, like Abraham before, demonstrates hospitality. He still has that going for him. In verse 1, he goes to these angels. Whether he knows they're angels or not, we don't know, but he goes to these men traveling through, and he bows to them. So he's humble, he's gracious, and offers them a place to stay, to wash their feet, relax. There's no hotels you can check into, so he's offering his own home for that. And they at first decline. They'll camp out in the town square, but Lot knew what that meant. He knew that wasn't safe, what kind of men made up the city that he was now a comfortable part of. And so in verse 3, he pressed them strongly. He insisted. He demonstrated his concern for their safety. Now, safe at his home, he makes a feast like the one Abraham had made for them earlier. And Lot demonstrated that he is a righteous man like Abraham. So he's a good host and gracious and generous. But before their feast was over, they were rudely interrupted by another demonstration, a demonstration of wickedness. The men of the city, and it's not just a minority, notice, but the whole of the city, says all the men to the last man of the whole society was sold out to sin. This is not just a faction of them, a minority that's out of step with the general population. No, this was what Sodom was about. And they gathered around the house, demanding that the men, really angels, and probably striking in appearance, you would guess, that he be given to them that they might have sex with them, that we might know them. At the end of verse 5 is a euphemism for sex, used several times in Genesis, particularly Genesis chapter 4. Adam knew his wife Eve, and she conceived. Obviously, that's referring to sex. So their carnal minds had become so debased and inflamed with perverted passion because the whole society fanned those flames of sexualization. They approved of it. They encouraged it. Now, verse 4 emphasizes that this crowd represented the whole city, and all of them approving of this, all of them encouraging each other, all of them putting the momentum of the world behind the impulses of the flesh. Jude's verse 7 says that they indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire. That unnatural desire is, of course, what we now call homosexuality. It's actually a new word. It's like only the last 100 years. What used to be called, because of this passage, sodomy. The Bible is clear that homosexuality is, in that old-fashioned language, an abomination, detestable, the newer language. And the Apostle Paul in Romans 1 calls it shameless acts and error and contrary to nature. And that last description, that it is contrary to nature, although is denied today, is simply, this is plainly, obviously, biologically, anatomically true. Now, people today will say, well, no, it's not, maybe unnatural for other people, not for me, because I'm born that way. That is their orientation, they'll say. But I don't think that's even an argument worth having. Even if we can prove that some people are inclined toward homosexuality, that would be no different than finding that some people are inclined toward stealing or drunkenness or violence. Just because some people have a weakness for certain sins doesn't mean that for them it's not a sin anymore. You say, well, I was born an alcoholic, so if I get drunk, this is who I am. Accept me for who I am. It just means that's something they have to strive to fight and overcome. That means that's their weakness, and they have to overcome that weakness. We probably all have our weaknesses that we need to fight to overcome, and if homosexuality is someone's weakness, then they have to try to overcome it. The man who steals can't get out of jail by claiming to the judge, I have kleptomania. It means inclination to steal. It's in my DNA. And the judge will go, I don't care. You can't steal. You got to control yourself. Go to jail. Someone with a violent orientation, there are people like that. They can't say, well, you just have to tolerate my violence because that's just the way I am. I was born inclined to violence. No, we say you have to control yourself. And so too, even if there are some people who through hormones or through upbringing, what they were exposed to early in life, are inclined to be homosexual, that's not an excuse to give into it. It's a notice that is something that they will need to fight to overcome. Notice in verse 9, in their rage, as Lot was trying to deter them, how dare he say that what we want was wicked? He goes out to them and says, no, my brothers, don't do this wickedness. And they were thinking, wait, you're saying what we want to do is wicked. No one can tell us what not to do. You're judging us. At the heart of this sin is a self-centered hatred of authority. The same thing at the Garden of Eden when Satan told to us, Adam and Eve, we were in Adam and Eve, Satan told us that God was a liar. God said, when the day you eat of it, you will die. And we said, no, we won't die. You know what? We believe we won't die. That's what we believe. We believe God is just trying to keep something good from us. We want it, and God just wants to keep it from us because he's not really loving. That fruit, that looks good. It tastes good. It looks like it tastes good. And it will make us wise. And when we do what God says don't do, we become like God. We become the authority, deciding for ourselves what is right or wrong. At the heart of sin is me hating anyone who tells me no. So when Lot tells them to stop, now no longer is he someone they let sit in leadership at the gate. Remember, he's in the gate. He's a leader. But now, after he tells them this is wicked, you shouldn't do this. Now he's a sojourner. In other words, you're a foreigner just passing through. Get out of here. How dare you try to judge us? The carnal mind, given over to pursuing its own pleasure, cannot tolerate the one who tells it no. And Paul says 3 times in Romans 1, God gave them up. They wanted this unnatural thing, and God, okay, here it is. You're given over to it. They exchanged the truth about God for the lies that they wanted to believe to suit themselves. And so God gave them up to exchange the natural, that's God created sexuality in marriage to a wife or a woman to a man, to the unnatural, that is the uncreated, twisted by human lust, what will not be restrained by God's no. The unnatural homosexual practices. Open homosexuality is a demonstration of God's judgment. Well, here the Sodomites demonstrated that they had been given over to unnatural lust by their sexualization of these 2 angels. They probably think they're just men, but they sexualize. They see them and this is for me. This is for my sexual pleasure. Homosexuality here demonstrates, like a symptom demonstrates the presence of a disease, it demonstrates the depths of depravity that people will fall into when they give up the glory of God as the creator to be worshiped. They give that up to serve themselves, to serve whatever they want, their passions, refusing to glorify God and get our final pleasure from him is the ultimate disease. Well, Lot tries to intervene in verse 6. He goes out to placate the mob. He even offers his daughters instead, as horrible as that is, but essentially saying that anything is preferable to abusing these visitors. There's no way that he should allow that. But it doesn't work. They are so consumed with their lust, so sexualized in their view of everyone, so given over to the idea that they must have whatever their flesh dreams could give them a new thrill. They sexualize them, and they must have that. And they're demonstrating that they've been given over to that lust, and then start to assault Lot. So they pressed hard against him, going to hurt him. And then the angels reach out their hands. So they open the door, they reach out their hands, grab him, and demonstrating God's hands of protection. And then in verse 11, they blind the men closest to the door. But notice at the end of verse 11, those men, they still don't give up. You think struck with blindness, okay, I'm going to go see a doctor about this. But now, even dazzled, unable to see, groping for the door, lunging like irrational animals. They can only think of fulfilling their instincts. Here's the demonstration of lives given over to lust, despite being blinded. They don't stop. They're so consumed with this thing they must have. It's only that now they can't find the door. So only that, it's exhausting themselves, groping for passion they must have. Then they run out of energy to pursue their depraved goal. That's the demonstration of the depths of depravity. Well, then comes the deliverance of Lot from verses 12 to 22. Abraham had interceded that if only 10 righteous could be found to spare the city. Remember, he got the Lord down to 10. 10, you should be able to find 10 easy, right, in a big city. Spare the city, but not that many can be found. And so God will not spare the city. But he will deliver the one righteous man from destruction. Abraham didn't even ask for that. He didn't say, will you spare, at least take the righteous out, even if there's less than 10. But the Lord does that anyway, despite not being asked. And so they tell Lot outright in verse 13 that the Lord is about to destroy this place. And he's allowed to bring all his family with him, a wife and 2 daughters, and what we would call their fiancés, which is here they call their sons-in-law, but they're not officially married yet. They could all be delivered. And so he went to his sons-in-law and told them in verse 14, the Lord, notice it's all capitals, it's Yahweh, is about to destroy the city. But they don't believe him. They thought it was ridiculous, like so many people today. In living their lives with their sin, and if you try to tell them about judgment, they'll think either you're joking or you're crazy, you're old-fashioned, you're bigoted. For many people today, the thought of judgment is just ridiculous. Talk of hell, of God holding us over the pit of hell like we might hold a spider or some loathsome insect, as in Jonathan Edwards' Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. That's treated like a joke now. The serious people don't talk like that anymore. We don't really believe that anymore. The idea that we need to flee from the wrath to come, like John the Baptist said, is just, today that's not serious. Don't talk like that. Sound like a child, some old-fashioned person from the dark ages. Lot's sons-in-law are from that culture, and so they don't take it seriously. They thought Lot was joking. Judgment? What's that? That's ridiculous. That's just a story. Our sins will go on. That's what happens when people lose a fear of God. They will stay in their sins, never believing that devastation will come, even when it's minutes away. Well, the sun rises over that eventful night. The clock is ticking downward to doomsday. The angels tell Lot and his family to hurry, get a move on, lest you be swept away in the punishment of the city. But in verse 16, he lingered. It's hard to get him moving. This was, after all, his home. So many memories. He was attached to the place. The people there were, he called them in verse 7, remember, my brothers. Were his friends. He had investments there. He had a nice house. He had his business there. He had colleagues that he knew. His people on the street, they would call out his name. He would wave at them. His daughters graduated from Sodom High School. They went to homecoming every year. He was a member of the Sodom Country Club. He cheered for the Sodom pro teams. Now, sure, he was embarrassed by many of the sins of the city, but it was his city. He lingered. He didn't want to go. Until finally the 2 angels had to grab him by the hand. Notice that. They had to grab him by the hand and walk them out. The Lord took them by the hand to lead them to safety. This is twice now. We've heard about hands. The angels reached out and grabbed him, pulled him back in the house, and now they're grabbing him by the hand to escort him out of the city to deliver him. And it says about this in the middle of verse 16 that it was the Lord being merciful to him. Could have left him to himself. He would have been destroyed with the rest of the city, but he was merciful to him. The deliverance of Lot was a demonstration of God's mercy. He was only one man out of the whole city of Sodom, Gomorrah, and the other nearby towns. Even Abraham had only thought to negotiate for 10. Below that, it's like he tacitly conceded, well, God can just destroy if there's less than 10. After all, which is worse? A handful of righteous people being killed, or a city full of wicked people allowed to continue on? As our military might say, there is an acceptable level of collateral damage. Why not just say, well, Lot, I'm sorry, you're the only one. I'm not going to go to the trouble just for you. But here we see in the deliverance a demonstration of God's mercy that goes beyond what we'd even think to ask for. It goes beyond what Abraham thought to ask for. The mercy doesn't stop there. They first tell him to flee to the mountains, but he apparently was afraid that he couldn't make it that far before the disaster comes. So he pleads for a little town, Zoar. The name means little. Now spare a little. I'll go there. To be spared so he could be safe there. And the angel says to him in verse 21, I grant you this favor. Favor is a gift of grace also. Then notice the mercy, the protection that is extended to Lot in verse 22. Escape there quickly, for I can do nothing until you arrive. The angel is under orders to not let loose God's judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah until Lot is safely out of the way. The Lord's committed to protecting Lot, demonstrating again in verse 16 his mercy for him. Mercy is not getting what we deserve, and we deserve judgment. Deliverance from judgment is always because of God's mercy. Third, devastation. When Lot and his wife and his 2 daughters make it safely to Zoar, the Lord rained sulfur and fire on Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, the Lord could have used natural means to say specifically how he did it, but he could have been an earthquake. It said it happened early in the morning. Earthquakes often happen early in the morning. Gases and petroleum, maybe sulfurous oil was gushing from the ground, and then lightning strikes the gases, setting it all on fire, incinerating everything, and the earthquake brings down the land below the sea level of the Dead Sea, causing it to be flooded with that deadly salt water, completely ruining the land. So everything died. That's the devastation brought by sin. But Lot's wife looked back. She couldn't believe what the angels told her. They had told her specifically, explicitly, don't look back. If she believed them, she would have obeyed and not looked back, but she couldn't believe it. She had lingered there this morning. She could hear the sounds, smell the sulfur, see the flashes, and it was her home. So hard to leave. Can't she just take one last look? For nostalgia, for old time's sake, for the memories, for the friends she had left back there. No, she can't. But she does. And so she became a pillar of salt. She became what was so common, still is so common in that land. She was part of the world, and so became part of the land. How can she be punished, though, for something that's so understandable? What's so wrong with a sentimental attachment to all that she left behind? But sometimes sentimentality is one of our worst enemies. She and Lot had lived in the city for years. Peter tells us in 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 7 to 8, that the things Lot saw there in Sodom tormented his righteous soul. It was troubling to Lot. Probably is to his wife too, to see all the perverse things going on in Sodom, this runaway sexualization. That troubled him. But in the end, they weren't so troubled that they felt they had to leave. They had to go elsewhere with their daughters to a better spiritual and moral environment, which is worse, they thought. Staying here in this troubling immorality, this troubling sexualization, or having to pick up and leave and go somewhere new and start all over. They never got so disgusted that they did something about it. Likely when they moved near the city, they thought, well, we better not go in there, at least not too much, because it has a bad reputation, bad things going on there. The whole place is a red light district. Then they got used to some of the things they saw during their few trips to the city, so they made more trips. Maybe then they began to think, well, we can be in the city, but not of it. Yes, that's what we'll do. Maybe they thought we could be a good influence on the people there. So they moved in. Our daughters, we'll send them to school there, and they'll be a good influence on the other kids. Now, sure, sometimes it was troubling what they saw in the marketplace, in the square, sometimes right out their window. But over time, it bothered them less and less. And they were like that frog in the pot. Supposedly, you put a frog in boiling water, it'll jump out immediately. But if you put it in room temperature water and gradually turn up the heat, you can boil yourself a frog. And no, it doesn't taste like chicken. Meanwhile, they got more and more connected to Sodom. More nostalgia, more sentimentality. Sentimentality is one of our worst enemies. People stay in churches that have declined and forsaken the living faith because of a sentimental attachment to that church. Our family's been in this church for generations. Or that building is special to me, whatever. People like traditions, like one of my least favorite, church homecomings, which undermine meaningful membership because they just got to keep doing it because it's a sentimental day to remember the good old days when these people used to come here. What's so wrong with that? What are we going to do as the sexualization of our society continues? What used to be shocking and shameful becomes natural, even legally protected. Do we sentimentally keep doing the same thing, support the same schools, voting the same way, allow the same media in our houses, shaping our children, while we try to ignore the changes? Maybe just bury ourselves in our little communities, sing the same old songs, absorbed in our old-time religion, and think that we'll insulate ourselves from it. It won't affect us. We can bury our heads in the sand, pretend nostalgically that it's not so bad. We won't be overwhelmed when the disaster reaches us and our families. Or will we flee for safety? The devastation was total. Abraham lived probably about 40 miles away, but he could see the smoke billowing upward like a furnace. In verse 28, Abraham stood in that place. He had negotiated for the cities to be spared. If only 10 righteous could be found there, I thought you did well. 10, surely there's 10 there. But there weren't 10. So thoroughly did the sexualizing culture warp the minds of everyone who was raised in it. These kinds of sins, this kind of sexual perversity, they're like an infection. And if you're not immunized by a new heart, you will catch it. You will be infected and warped by it. But God was merciful anyway to Abraham's nephew Lot. The warning and rescue by the angels all happens because, it says in verse 29, in his mercy, God remembered, not Lot actually, but Abraham, the man who had been given the promise, given the gospel. He believed the gospel. He was a believer. And he prayed for Lot. Which is worse? Sexualization or censorship? Americans are trained to think, well, censorship leads to tyranny, and that's the worst possible thing. And so even if we hate porn, totally opposed to porn, still we think, well, we have to allow it. We have to allow sexualization because of it. That's what we think. But sexualization leads to, fourth, debauchery. We see that with Lot's daughters. They were shaped by Sodom's culture. Now, sure, they were raised in Lot's house, but they went out into the culture and they caught the infection there. We can't think that if we let in every sexualizing influence of Hollywood, of the music, of our world, of our society, exposing our children to immorality through television or movies or video games or the internet or bad songs or bad friends, we can't think that we can allow all that without them being poisoned by it, without them being infected by sexualization. Sexualization is harmful, especially to children. Lot chose to live first near Sodom, then in Sodom, then he became of Sodom and his thinking was, well, it's greener there. There's good land around Sodom. It's a better economic future for my family to move to Sodom. We'll make more money there. But he didn't take into account the spiritual future, the impact of what his family saw in that society on them. The result was a debauched society sexualized two girls. The result of exposing two girls to debauchery was two debauched girls. Debauchery means an excessive indulgence in sensual pleasures, a seduction away from morality, living for immorality. Sodom was completely debauched society. If it feels good, do it, was their motto. But apparently Lot thought that he could raise 2 girls in it without them being adversely affected. How did it turn out, Lot? Look at these last 8 verses. He raised them in a sexualized environment, and so, along with him, they sexualized him. That's the debauchery, the debasing that the carnal mind sinks to. And the result, in the long run, the products of their sexualization, and literally of their sex, were 2 enemies of God's people. The Moabites will later try to use sexuality to entice Israel away from the Lord. The Ammonites, too, were enemy of the Lord's people. Such was the legacy of Lot's life. We live in a society increasingly like Sodom. Even the demonstrations of sin, the sexualization, are beginning to look the same. But if we think that dealing with the symptoms of enough, we can suppress these symptoms, no. If we can only return to the good old days of morality and decency, conservative religion, if we think that this in Sodom, in Genesis 19, that this is the worst, this is the lowest, that they committed the worst sin, and they got the worst punishment. And so we're going to avoid that by suppressing them. We'll choose better sins. That's what we think. We're wrong. Which is worse? Homosexuality or hypocritical religion that appears to say all the right things, that suppresses sexualization, but rejects Jesus? Which is worse? In Matthew chapter 11, the Lord Jesus spoke about the cities that he and his disciples had been preaching the gospel of the kingdom. They had heard the word right from Jesus himself and the apostles themselves. They had seen the miracles. They were conservative, what we would call conservative. They were religious. They were strictly moral. They would never allow this kind of thing in their cities. They would be like Singapore as far as pornography is concerned. They were trying to keep God's law, and yet they became worse, Jesus said, because they did not repent and believe him. He concluded in Matthew chapter 11, verse 29, I tell you, it will be more tolerable on the day of judgment for the land of Sodom than for you. Yes, it's common to say, we live in a society like Sodom. If God doesn't judge America, you'll have to apologize to Sodom. But which is worse? It's even worse today that people have heard here in our society that Jesus is Lord. They've heard at least some of the word. Churches all over this area say something of the truth. Even if they don't go to church themselves, they have you hear it from people who do. But the people hear the truth, they hear the word, and they still refuse to submit to Jesus as Lord. They refuse to repent that they have had the witness and that they have hardened themselves to it. Will make it worse for them. We have so many today who think that they have been delivered from devastation. They've been delivered from judgment. They will not have to face God's judgment for their lives because maybe they said a few magic words, repeat after me prayer as a child. Or maybe they think, well, they've lived decently. And they think because they said the words, that they don't have to demonstrate in their lives that Jesus really is their king, their judge, that they can hear the word and not follow Jesus, not be baptized, not attend church, or maybe they can treat their black neighbors as second class, or they can lie, or they can run the church by nostalgia instead of the word of God, or they can practice sex out of marriage, or they can indulge in pornography, or they can just live their own way. And no judge will hold them accountable. Like the men of Sodom. Who are you to tell us what's wicked? There's no covenant. There's no scripture restraining them from doing what they want to do. And they think they're safe from devastation because they said something some time back. It could be homosexuality that they choose. Or it could be playing golf. or making money instead of worshiping the Lord, or clinging to the racism that the old-time religion was able to live easily with, or it could be the stubborn refusal to flee from the wrath to come, to look back, the choice they made to look back longingly on the society that there wasn't rebellion against God, but that was my home. I'll stick with that, the way things used to be. And Jesus says it will be more tolerable on the day of judgment for the land of Sodom than for you. Which is worse? The sinful life that looks debauched, or that looks outwardly? It looks all right. It looks decent. Sometimes the decent people are the hardest to reach because they think their decency is enough. But Jesus says it'll be more tolerable for Sodom. In other words, it'll be worse for you. That should shake us to our core, bring us to our knees, break through our sentimental love for the familiar, for the way things used to be, destroy our nostalgia for an old-time religion that told us we were okay because we said we believed, even if we lived in rebellion against Jesus, the King and the Judge. And that warning, it'll be worse for us than these people, the people here of Sodom. It'll be worse for us, having heard the word. And if we do not believe it, if we do not believe that Jesus is Lord, that word should finally bring us to look squarely at who we are in our sins and who the Lord is, unleashing devastation. As comical or as childish as many people today think it is to be taught about judgment, about hell, it is still the reality. And we realize that here. We realize that finally it's not our decency that delivers us from disaster. So what are we to do? Hold out our empty hands that the Lord may mercifully take us by them and lead us to safety. Do that now.